Well, good evening, everyone. I'm not using my best school teacher voice. Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Levengood, president of the Marshall Foundation, and I'm delighted that we lured so many of you in out of such a beautiful evening. You could be spending it outside, doing your yard or whatever, so I appreciate your willingness to come in and spend time inside with us tonight. A couple of housekeeping items, as always. Excuse me. I'm delighted, as I do at these lectures frequently, to thank Dominion Energy, who is a Legacy Series sponsor, and Dominion has long been a great partner to us at the Marshall Foundation, and we do appreciate that support. Our next Legacy lecture will be Saturday, May 18th, so a little bit different, not a weeknight. This is part of our annual open house that we'll hold that day. So that afternoon, we will hear from Dr. Furman Daniel on General Marshall's famously shy and retiring colleague, George S. Patton. So get out your pearl-handled pen and mark your calendar for May 18th. As always, before the lecture, I remind you to silence your cell phone. We don't want to interrupt our speaker or the rest of the audience. Now, again, I would tell everyone online, we have an audience that comes to us through the beauties of the internet. So from here in Lexington, we say hello to everyone online on YouTube, and you will be able to ask questions. You can either use the chat feature at the bottom right of your screen, or you can email those questions to my colleague Melissa at librarian@marshallfoundation.org, and she will then send those questions in at the end of the lecture this evening. Now, for this evening's speaker. Ed Guitry earned an undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan, a master's at the University of Manchester, and a doctorate at Rutgers. He is an associate professor of history at Virginia Tech, just down the road, where he has taught since 2014, it looked like from his CV. His scholarship has appeared in the Journal, The History of the Behavioral Sciences, Current Research in Digital History, other academic journals, and edited volumes, as well as in the media, Business Insider, The Conversation, and The Washington Post, among others. He's currently writing a book on the battle over Jim Crow in World War II. Most interestingly, perhaps, for his lecture tonight, he is director of The American Soldier in World War II, a digital history project underwritten by the National Endowment for the Humanities that has made tens of thousands of uncensored first-hand accounts of U.S. military personnel accessible to scholars, students, and any of us who would like to go on and use this fabulous resource. And he'll speak to us about it this evening. And in front of this group, I would like to thank him. He is also one of the guest faculty members for our Summer Teachers Institute this year. There's actually a poster up in the lobby you can see after the talk. But please join me in a warm Lexington welcome for Ed Guitry.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Paul, for the invitation, and to the Foundation for bringing me to the campus this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to talk about my project and the research that was conducted during World War II, the focus of my conversation, which I'm just going to jump right into now. So what I'm going to talk about is the most ambitious endeavor in the applied social and behavioral sciences in U.S. history that most Americans have never heard of. That endeavor was to tap the social and behavioral sciences and U.S. effort to mobilize, train, motivate, and manage the nation's manpower for war. No army had ever done anything like this before. The U.S. Army was so small and under-resourced in 1939 when George C. Marshall was promoted to Chief of Staff that he compared it to that of a third-rate power, consisting of a scant 174,000 enlisted personnel and 13,000 officers. The War Department's plan to enlarge the Army in preparation for war was to rely on volunteers, at least until the U.S. entered the conflict formally. Congress had never authorized a peacetime draft, and there was little appetite to break with tradition to save Europe. But the shocking fall of France that mid-June ignited a fierce debate about how unprepared the nation was to defend itself and whether a draft was in fact necessary. Defenders of voluntarism insisted it was the American way, and that not only would conscription break with the nation's democratic traditions, that it would bring totalitarianism to the United States. Proponents of the draft doubled down, arguing that compulsory universal training and service was not only compatible with democracy, but was the most democratic way to raise an army because responsibility would be shouldered equitably. Germany's assaults of the British Isles helped clear the way for the September 7th passage of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. Still, enacting the draft as a peacetime measure had a profound and lasting influence on the Army and on American life. Secretary of War Henry Stimson explained, quote, "We are, in time of peace, mobilizing and training a large army through this instrumentality of a selective service system. The success of this civil process will be dependent upon the Army's ability to return these soldiers to civilian life in an enthusiastic state of mind toward their period of service. In a large sense, this provides an opportunity to popularize the Army with our people, which is essential for an efficient fighting force," end quote. To win over skeptical citizens, the government and the Army would extend arguments that proponents of the draft made that summer. Citizens were promised that America's Army would be a democratic army, made up of ordinary citizen soldiers and reflective of the wider public. We need to appreciate not only this message, but how it was communicated. FDR viewed public opinion as the lifeblood of his administration and of democracy. He explained, quote, "The whole structure of a democracy rests upon public opinion. Indeed, under a government which functions through democratic institutions, we are ruled by public opinion. Now, more than ever, the voice of the American citizen has to be heard and known. Only through the full and free expression of public opinion can the springs of democracy be renewed and its institutions be kept alive and capable of functioning," end quote. During his long tenure in office, FDR created a sprawling communications apparatus, a constituency service on a vast scale to register and respond to public opinion. Arguably, the most effective tool was radio, which allowed him to bypass news outlets and speak directly and formally to the public. Who hasn't heard a fireside chat? Letter writing was another effective arm. He would urge radio listeners to write in response to various New Deal programs to gauge their appeal and to recruit volunteers. He also urged citizens to write congressmen to let them know how they felt about one political issue or another. To the right, you see the deluge of letters that came in after FDR encouraged children to post dimes to help raise money for the March of Dimes for polio research. Nearly 27 million came rolling in. If these were the public face of FDR's communications apparatus, behind these scenes, the administration relied on ear-to-the-ground reporting using journalists, informants, agency personnel, and field offices, as well as newspaper clipping services to gauge public opinion and to tailor messaging. It is no surprise then that his administration would warm so quickly to another modern invention that, like radio, was revolutionizing how politicians, businessmen, and advertisers interacted with the public. See, up until the beginning of his presidency, public opinion research had been incredibly labor-intensive and time-consuming. One way of surveying was to send field workers out into a community and canvass a community, going door to door and asking questions and afterwards recording the responses. Another method was to use straw polls, where, for instance, magazines would send out ballots to all their subscribers and ask them to fill out the ballots and send them in. The most storied of these operations was the Literary Digest, which distributed upwards of 20 million ballots to predict successfully the outcome of multiple presidential elections. In 1933, so this is coinciding early with his presidency, several pollsters working on marketing research developed a new, more modern scientific technique that reduced the time, money, and resources necessary to conduct public opinion research. So what they would do, instead of canvassing an entire community, they would select one individual for every 9 or 10 people and target that population and use what they called random sampling. A pioneer in this effort was Elmo Roper, who many of you I'm sure know, who became director of Fortune Survey, the first national poll using this technique in 1935. And then immediately took on the Literary Digest, predicting not only that FDR would win re-election, unlike the Digest prediction, but he estimated just how far off the Digest would be. That was a debacle for the magazine and the way in which it had conducted surveys, but it was a boon for random sampling. So FDR's administration continued to rely on this front porch conversations and other sorts of reporting, but started to incorporate modern polling and marketing research into its efforts to gauge, move, and respond to public opinion. So it's important to understand the larger context for what I'm going to talk about now. So it was only fitting that the administration would draw upon this applied social research to help stand up a modern citizen soldier army that was to reflect the public and public opinion. In April of 1941, the man to the right, the head of Fortune Surveys, Elmo Roper, offered his polling services to the War Department. But at the time, the general staff was divided. Marshall was for it, but others were not, chiefly Wade Hayslip, who was the new Assistant Chief of Staff of Personnel. He thought polling soldiers would undermine morale, breed disloyalty, and weaken command, especially if they let civilian interviewers onto post and allowed them access to soldiers. They like, do not let the long-haired professors onto our posts. It'll wreak havoc. The head of the morale branch was actually thinking about doing polling himself, but instead of using civilians, using officers. So the man on the left, which I'm sure most of you know, the Secretary of War, when he learned of the proposal, he shut it down in no uncertain terms, issuing this May 23rd, 1941 order. Quote, "Our Army must be a cohesive unit with a definite purpose shared by all. Such an army can be built only on the responsible effort of all of its members, commissioned and enlisted. Anonymous opinion or criticism, good or bad, is destructive in its effect on a military organization, where accepted responsibility on the part of every individual is fundamental. It is therefore directed that because of their anonymous nature, polls will not be permitted among the personnel of the Army of the United States." Couldn't be any clearer. This could have been the end of the story. But for the towering individual that you see there standing in the front and center left from our perspective, meet Frederick Osborne, a wealthy retired executive, a fundraiser for the social sciences, and an extremely well-connected blue blood from the New York State's Hudson River Valley. a dollar a year man, he had originally been tapped to oversee the writing of the draft regulations after it was passed. And then he was asked afterward to continue to assist with mobilization by coordinating morale services between the War Department and Navy and entertainers, Hollywood, radio executives, educators through a joint civilian-military coordinating committee that he chaired. He was tasked with these important roles, not only because of his political disposition and acumen, which made him really well suited for such delicate tasks, but also because his family and the Roosevelt family had gone back generations. In fact, FDR himself and Frederick Osborne had been childhood friends. So you see him in uniform here because he was appointed the chief of the U.S. Army Morale Branch later in the summer of 1941. So again, recall the debate about conscription. As the man charged with overseeing the writing of draft policies and regulations, Osborne played a significant, if invisible, role in helping build that democratic army. He was himself also something of a self-taught social scientist. He believed in the power of data and the value of measuring and responding to public opinion, just like the White House. So what happened is, right after he became the chief of the Morale Branch, he quickly coordinated with the man on the right there. You see Frederick Keppel, who was the president at the time of the Carnegie Corporation, an international philanthropy upon whose board Osborne sat. So they knew each other really well. So with Marshall's tacit approval and a $100,000 grant from the corporation, he started putting into place a scheme to circumvent that ban on polling so that he, the corporation, and the country's leading social science academic society could create this applied social behavioral science research outfit inside the War Department. He immediately assigned Samuel Stouffer, a University of Chicago sociologist, if you can see him right there in the bottom right, to run that survey program. And by mid-October, so this is 1941, October of 1941, with that approval from Marshall, he discreetly secured the basis for this survey program from him and started to develop a questionnaire that was already in the works and being pre-tested at Camp Lee, not far from Washington, D.C., in just a matter of days. I mean, he wasted no time. The research team was in a rush. The international situation was uncertain. And also, the holiday season was fast approaching, and soldiers were going to be on furlough, and so they might have to push the survey that he needed to get out the door, wanted to get out the door into the new year. But it was critical for them, they felt, that they needed to do the survey to show Stimson and others in charge the value of it. It just so happened that they got approval from the commanding officer, commanding general of Fort Bragg, to administer what was called Planning Survey 1 to the Ninth Division stationed there the week of December 8th. Just by happenstance. So a small research team from DC came down and arrived and was in the process of training local personnel to help with that survey. And as they were doing it, the news flash came over the radio announcing the attack against Pearl Harbor. Worried that the men from the 9th might be shipped out, not knowing what was going to happen, they went into high gear. Starting the next morning, they had a questionnaire with 118 questions, and they started to administer it and bring in groups of 40 to 50 men to fill out this questionnaire, and they used that random sampling method. So about 1,800, about 10% of the 9th Division to create this cross-section. So at Fort Bragg, they set the pattern that they would use, the process that they would use for the surveys that were to follow. So a small team would travel to a base, get permission from the post commander, and using military records would start to put together a population using random sampling. The men chosen would be ordered to a camp theater, to a mess hall. They wouldn't know why they were being assembled. They would be brought in these groups of 40 or 50. They would call them classes, and they would sit there and they would fill out questionnaires. What's really important to know about the process that they used is that they were promised complete anonymity. Nobody would know who wrote what. So commanding officers would have no idea what the men were writing. It was important for these surveyors, the researchers, to get honest answers from the soldiers. And so they repeatedly made sure that they knew, be honest with us. What were soldiers asked? So the Army surveys typically started with demographic information, like where they were from, education levels, civilian employment. They would ask them about their branch, position, rank, etc. They were also asked about their adjustment to military life, about the organization, about training, leadership, so on and so forth. To tabulate the data from this first survey, Planning Survey 1, the research branch had to borrow specialized coders and clerks, as well as punch card machines and operators from other federal agencies, because they didn't have the staff to do it themselves, nor the technology. And in addition to needing the staff to help them process this data, the machines, they also wanted these agencies to process their data that they had been collecting as well, to try to create a composite of the Army at that time. Just to give you a sense of how large this operation was in the beginning. Osborne requested from the Census Bureau a tabulation of data on the entire male population between 18 and 44 on schooling, marital condition, and dependence. This hadn't been done before. Using hundreds of machines and employees, the Bureau ran tabulations from 1.2 million punch cards. No less monumental was the task performed by the Adjutant General's office, which ran 30,000 cards and delivered tabulations on a 20% sample of enlisted men to get more information on age, education, et cetera. And then there was also data that was processed by the Selective Service System as well. All of this was accomplished in a matter of weeks. Perhaps the most important finding from that first survey related to education and education levels. Selectees were across the board more educated than their counterparts who had served in World War I. Whereas a full 79% of selectees from the Great War hadn't gone beyond grade school, that percentage had dropped to 31%. So from 79 to 31. Only 4% of World War I draftees had graduated high school. Only 4%. That number had risen to 30%. African Americans still lagged behind their white counterparts, but their average education level was the equivalent of white enlistees in the Great War. So not only did the GIs have more education, but by extension, they also entered the Army with valuable professional experience and knowledge. It's really important. To the question on Planning Survey 1, does your present Army duty or job allow you to use the training and experience you had outside the Army? 53% selected the response, no, never. And to the question, have you learned any skills in the Army which will help you get a better job when you get out? I mean, this was a promise that was made. You're not going to waste your time if you're drafted. The response was even more negative, with 73% responding no. The combination of these factors, promises made to soldiers about the nature of the Army, that it would be a democratic Army, their higher educational levels, and the professional skills that they came into the Army with, set high expectations, both how they thought they should be treated as citizen soldiers, but how the Army should be run as an organization. And remember, by the end of the war, this was the largest employer, largest organization in U.S. history. Soon after that first survey, Planning Survey 1 was issued, Osborne's portfolio was expanded when the Morale Branch morphed into Special Services Division under the Service of Supply in a major War Department reorganization. This would tax his time personally, but also created new opportunities. So I'm going to talk about one really critical opportunity that happened, that opened up in the summer of 1942 as troops were amassing on the British Isles. He gave General Eisenhower a copy of an orientation booklet prepared by his Special Service Division that was given to men in transit to the United Kingdom. It was titled A Short Guide to Great Britain. And the goal was to help orient American troops to the British Isles, its culture, its people, to help create mutual association, to foster mutual association. He gave him that booklet with an ulterior motive, with an agenda. He was using that booklet, or wanted to use that booklet, to help sell the services of the research branch. And around that time, Elmo Roper was in conversation with the U.S. ambassador to the UK, and they both thought it was a great idea to do a survey of soldiers about the relationship with the UK. And together, they were able to persuade Eisenhower to appoint, at least on a temporary basis, an expert in public opinion sampling. At the time, the research branch was really struggling to staff up. Military personnel was coming and going. It was still really small. They had the civilian consultants, but they were really struggling. So this was an amazing opportunity to expand and to really establish this research branch. And again, Stimson had no idea what was going on. This was all behind his back. So we got approval, immediately started working on a questionnaire of about 3,700 men who were in the theater. And just like the other surveys, they were asked demographic information about their pay, savings, spending, furloughs, and whatnot. They were asked about BBC radio broadcasts and a radio program, about reading, sports, recreational preferences, whether they wrote home, what movies they like to watch. Did they go into town? Did they drink beer or liquor? They were also asked about what they thought of English civilians and soldiers, about visiting British homes, dating English girls. Army talks about the British and whether they had read that pamphlet that Eisenhower had been given. The research branch was able to churn out a report with remarkable speed, and they were able to do that by using survey data that they had collected earlier that summer. And here are some of the results. Now, we're talking about just months after Pearl Harbor. From a quarter to a half of the men still lacked any strong motivation to fight and preferred to avoid combat service. A quarter to a half. Half of the men, this report says, are complacent and over-optimistic. They think the war will end soon, they think they can stay on the defensive, and they don't expect to see active service overseas at all. It's really interesting. A quarter to a half of the men have doubting or outright cynical attitudes regarding the reasons we are in the war and American war aims. And these attitudes present a serious handicap in training, as you can imagine. 2 and 5, distrust our English allies, and the average enlisted man has relatively low opinion of them as fighters. Number 5, which is on this screen, present methods of indoctrination are insufficient. Nor is it safe to assume the man will get adequate information through normal channels such as newspapers, they reported. Listen to this. Only about half the men read the newspapers regularly, and half of them distrust what they read in the papers. Sound familiar? 6, a large number give evidence on tests of having very, very inadequate information about world events. And 7, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment, carefully controlled studies have demonstrated that good instructional procedures utilizing oral and visual presentation on subject matter increases information and definitely influences attitudes in the desired direction. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, very briefly. But I want to stress this, number 8. Men ask for this kind of information and clarification, which the data given in this report show that they need. So the men are asking for more information. They want to know about world events. They want to know more. I'm just going to zero in for a moment on that 7th finding from the report regarding oral and visual presentations. For the report, Osborne had relied upon a survey that had been conducted earlier in the summer of 1,600 enlisted men. And they were tested on their knowledge about and attitudes towards China as one of the United Nations. And what happened is 4 days later, they were grouped in 3 different groups. One had seen the informational film that you see here, the screenshot from the Battle of China. Group B had heard only a lecture about China's part in the war, and C, there was a control group that had received neither of these. 2 weeks later, the same groups were restudied to see if it had changed their attitudes. And what they found was that the lectures and the film significantly changed their attitudes. Whereas for the control group, it didn't at all. So this was really, really important to Marshall and to others to understand how best to motivate men for war, to use film and conversation. And so in terms of education, what the Army would do during this period was cutting edge and helped to change the way that people thought about education and technology at the time. Soldiers in another large survey had been asked to rate a list of 8 nations according to their military strength and the fighting ability of their soldiers. Here's what the survey revealed. For the rating, this might surprise you, ratings of the nation's military strength, number 1, strongest, Russia. Then Germany, followed by England. 4th, Japan, followed by Australia, China, Italy, and pulling in the rear, Finland. Regarding fighting ability of soldiers, best, number 1, Russians. Then Germans, Australians, Finns, English, 6, Japanese, followed by Chinese and Italians in the poorest. Note the ranking of Japanese soldiers in 6th place. At that time, Marshall was receiving communications of the battle and what was happening in Guadalcanal. This concerned him. He was determined that American soldiers need to know what they're up against and what it's going to take to win this war. The production of this report was at a watershed moment for the research branch. It was right before the North African campaign. Somerville, who was the commanding general of what was then the Services of Supply, under which the Special Services Division operated, wanted to use all media that was available to the Army to the fullest extent in order to instill this proper attitude toward the war. So they were already using shortwave radio programming, orientation films, this Frank Capra's Why We Fight films that were in production, the Yank magazine. Every technology and media at their disposal, the Army wanted to use in order to inculcate these values in American troops. And he also asked that the research branch study the effectiveness of these technologies and tools. The report was a great success. Eisenhower concurrently established a research section in ETO. It would have been temporary initially. A copy of the report went to the White House, and part of the Brain Trust was really excited about it, showed it to FDR, wanted more reports like that. But even Stimson comes around. Congress around this time was debating cutting off the sale of beer on bases. And the two of them, Stimson was having lunch with Osborne, and Osborne slipped him the data, show it from one of those surveys showing that men were not drinking as much as people supposed, and they preferred beer over liquor. Stimson may have been a little unnerved by the fact that something had been, some polls had been conducted behind his back, but he sure did like that information, and the men continued to get their beer as a result of it. A year later, the research branch could not keep up with the demand, especially in the European theater. The director of the research section wrote to Osborne in September of 1943 to let him know that the studies requested of the section or suggested were, quote, piling up faster than we can hope to carry them out with a staff twice the present size. Dozens of reports were in the pipeline. From Marshall on down, Osborne was getting kudos, receiving kudos for the work that they were doing, including from Leslie McNair for an officer study report. He asked that a copy of that report be distributed to all ground force general officers down to the division level. And he himself wrote a letter to go with it, with that report. He was also appreciative of a report on what infantrymen think of the infantry, writing Osborne to let him know what he thought and how valuable it was. And one of the things that the survey had revealed was that a large percentage of those infantrymen had misconceptions about their role in the infantry and of teamwork in modern warfare. So there were a number of steps that were taken to help change attitudes using the Bureau of Public Relations, Yank magazine. Here you have a copy of Newsmap, and this one came out the week of D-Day to help change perceptions. Another result of this survey was the introduction of the combat and expert infantry badges in October of 1943. And the research branch was tasked with studying the effectiveness of these different efforts that they were making, including using the badges. So this was one of the early successes, because I'm sure many of you know about those badges and how important they were for so many men. By early 1944, research units were active in all nine theaters and commands outside the continental U.S., giving this operation basically worldwide coverage. Unfortunately, in mid-May, Eisenhower ordered that no more studies were to be conducted in ETO in preparation for the Normandy landing. He wanted to pivot all activities in preparation for the invasion by focusing on orientation and information. He wrote to his top generals, I feel strongly that as the day at our combined offensive approaches, it is necessary to make absolutely clear to our men the stark and elemental facts as to the character of our Nazi enemy. The absolute need for crushing him if we are to survive. And finally, to drive home the fact that we have defeated them before and can do it again. It is only necessary to steel ourselves to the task. So those various tools that they had been using, the technologies, the booklets, news maps, film, orientation film, lectures, all of those were then used in the lead up to D-Day to prepare men for what they were about to encounter and experience. He closed that same letter. This is not the time for long discussions of the roots and causes of war. Our soldiers have heard this before. What is required now is to impress on them that only hard and successful fighting will bring victory, and that the way home is via Berlin. So the research section had to put a pause on their activities, but what they did do was use previous surveys that they had done and talked, for instance, and use those surveys to talk about combat training and what was necessary for the invasion. If I had a little more time, I would talk about how Osborne used survey information also to correct misperceptions among the American public, including newspapermen who were critical of the Army and its leadership. But I'm going to move forward here in time. So why there was this pause on surveying infantrymen and the ground forces, it would continue in the Air Force, the Strategic Air Forces. Immediately prior to the invasion, as many of you, most of you know, and during their precious first weeks, flying personnel were under terrific strain from the continuous flying under incredibly difficult conditions. And as a result of that, Spatz and also Jimmy Doolittle, who was commanding the 8th Air Force, wanted to continue these surveys to make sure that they were doing everything that they could to make sure that these crews were operating at their optimal level. And so they started getting all of these reports from surveys that told them about the effects of combat encounters. They were asking personnel about their training, attitudes towards their flying combat missions, about higher at headquarters, just a whole number of issues they were asked about. What they found was that morale was actually really quite high despite all the difficulties. But one of the things that they did focus on was trying to calculate how many days crews could be, or how many missions crews could be engaged in before they started to become inefficient or before men started to break down. And to do that, they asked the men themselves, how many days could they do it? And then they compared that information with some more statistical information about psychiatric rates of men. So you can imagine how critical this information was for command and policy and setting the number of missions that crews would be expected, or at least knowing how many they could be engaged in before they became inefficient. But another thing that they would do is that they use this survey data to also inform soldiers and airmen. So what you see here is a copy of a periodical, a digest called What the Soldier Thinks. And I have to give the library here a shout out because you've digitized all these and I use them on my website. But you can see here there's some statistical data here, but they also curated quotes from open-ended responses to help motivate men. And this was circulated across the world. At one point, over 100,000 different, 100,000 printings were done for each issue and circulated down to the company level. The research section was allowed to ramp back up and do more surveying, following soldiers on their way to Berlin, asking them about their combat experience, about first aid, hospital care, about psychoneurotic breakdowns. They also asked them and was conducting research with the Surgeon General's office to find out how many days infantrymen and could be in combat before breaking down, calculated that. Surveys were applied to hundreds of problems in and far beyond ETO. Here's just a little list. Why, for instance, did men in malarial regions fail to use atabrine as regularly as they should? Why in Italy did men fail to take preventative measures to protect themselves against venereal disease? Among troops engaged in the Battle of the Bulge and drive to Berlin in the winter of 1944 and 45, what were their attitudes? What attitudes or practices led to trench foot? What were the favored types of winter clothing among these men in the front lines? What kind of huts did men in Alaska prefer? What did service members like to read in Yank magazine? What kind of books did they prefer to read? What kind of sporting equipment did they want and use? What kind of courses did they want to take? Some of the content from these surveys had a direct bearing on military operations and efficiency, but quite a lot of it looks a lot like marketing research. But imagine you are printing simultaneously over 2.5 million copies of Yank magazine from offices around the globe. You have a 400 outlet radio service that spreads across 56 countries, broadcasting 1,000 hours weekly directly from the US by shortwave. You're operating a correspondence course program with an enrollment of 1 million students. You're shipping millions and millions of bats, pocket-sized books, basketballs, and banjos to servicemen around the world. You'd want to know, what do the men want? What are they going to use? What's going to improve morale? What did the men think about being surveyed? Sometimes they would say on the back page what they thought of it. And each survey that was given, at the very end, they'd have this open-ended prompt where men could write about whatever they wanted to. Here's one example from an African-American soldier. I won't read the transcript, but you can see he took advantage of this opportunity to talk back to command and to tell the Army exactly what he thought about his service. He talks very passionately, writes very passionately about the problem of discrimination. And I'll be done in just a couple of minutes here. Over the course of the war, the research branch surveyed 500,000 officers and enlisted men. 500,000, and this was just sampling. So imagine all that information they got from that smaller sample. Whether soldiers knew or not that this programming existed, it directly impacted their lives. For instance, the training program that was introduced early on in the war, that was a result of testing. They were able to significantly shorten the time of training that men went through during basic training, significantly reducing it. So it was not only on the front end, but also the back end. As early as 1943, the research branch and the division it was part of was already preparing for the post-war transition. And they wanted to know what men were contemplating doing after the war. So one of the things that they did was that they surveyed men about the GI Bill of Rights, and some of the calculations for the Bill of Rights came from the research that was conducted. The point score system that was used to determine when men were going to come home That was the direct result of asking men what they thought should be the priority on who should come home, at what rate. So whether they had seen combat, whether they were a parent, how long they had been in, and that's how they determined the calculation for the point system. So this affected all these men coming home. So I just want to talk really, really briefly, if you'll indulge me, on one of the more significant outcomes of these surveys. So I showed you a sample of a survey from an African-American soldier, and one of the things that the research branch was tasked with surveying and keeping an eye on was race relations. In 1944, as there was a need for replacements in Europe, the Army made a decision to basically go against a promise that was made at the beginning of the war of not mixing troops, white and black service members. A program was introduced, as many of you may know, to have African Americans volunteer for combat in the European theater. Many of them did, even though they lost their rank and wanted to serve in combat. What ultimately happened was that they didn't integrate at the platoon level, but at the company level. And what the research branch did was they were asked to survey the results of this experience. And what they found was two things: that African American soldiers performed remarkably well, and their white officers reported in surveys before and after about their experience. But the second thing also was that it improved race relations. The report from that at first was not made public, but when it got out that through this surveying program, which the Army had become dependent upon and had used so extensively, for African Americans, this was hard proof. All the assumptions that had been made about African Americans and their capacity of war, they proved them wrong. And what happened was that this research was used in 1948 with Truman's executive order desegregating the military, and also in Brown versus Board of Education. In fact, a couple of the researchers who were involved with the program were part of those court cases in overturning Brown versus Board of Education. So if you think about the civil rights movement and the history of the 20th century, more broadly, the impact of this one research program in the Army was profound. So just wrapping up here, at the end of the war, about 1 million punch cards were preserved and copied for future analysis, and then also about 65,000 pages of those open-ended responses were put in microfilm. And what I was able to do, I came across these in 2009, worked with the National Archives to get it all digitized. It's all been transcribed, and it's now available for anyone to use. So I think at this point, about 115,000 people have used these resources, and they cover everything. Like I said, what did men like to eat? What kind of clothing did they like? You name it. It's all available at AmericanSoldierWorldWar2.org. Okay, so I've got a little over what I wanted to, but I would love to entertain some questions. Yes.
I've got one. Maybe I didn't understand. You said early in the war that the survey showed that the American soldier put Russia, the Soviet Union, in first place after their disastrous war with Finland and then Barbarossa. How does that make sense?
This is what they said. So the question is, there's some surprise that the Russian soldiers were ranked as the best in that list. I gave you the ranking of 8. That's what men said. But you could see why Marshall was so alarmed when he saw how poorly Americans thought of Japanese soldiers. You know, they were tenacious. I mean, he was getting reports of their ruthlessness and their abilities, and he was alarmed. He's like, we've got to do something about this. So he focused less on Russia being number one, but on the position for Japan, Japanese army. But that's what the men said. Russia. Yes.
Were any surveys done later in the course of the war to compare to the findings in that finding survey about what attitudes, you know, how did the attitudes change? Did they look at that with data?
They did. One of the things that really surprised them in surveys that were done in the summer of '45 of how quickly attitudes changed towards the Germans versus the Japanese. After the defeat of Hitler, basically, there was a really quick turn of attitudes and opinions, and they were far more accepting of the Germans. Whereas with the Japanese, they still, those attitudes didn't change very much, and they were like, you know, decimate them. That was the attitude of a lot of soldiers. Whereas with Germany, they were like, you know, basically let's control them, but it was still quite favorable, their views. So all along they were, what's really interesting is even in the early surveys, they were already preparing for America's place in the post-war world and asking men about what they thought about what the U.S.'s position should be in the world. And so they expected them to be informed. Not to be just so focused on what was happening in the foxholes, but also to think about America's place. So that was really interesting to me, even early in the war. It's like, basically, what do you think about international affairs? Yeah. Yes.
I can give you two conflicting, or actually supporting, why they felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
My father was in the 2nd Division.
Okay.
And endured a lot of really heavy fighting. But once they crossed the Rhine, I mean, things were just mopping up.
Yeah.
And the
yeah.
Germans were happy to surrender.
Yeah.
Glad to surrender to Americans, and very helpful. And, you know, my dad got to see them as just like us.
Mm-hmm.
And he nipped to his dying day at 92, he would not call a German soldier a Nazi unless he knew he was.
Mm-hmm.
But his father fought in Japan. And another thing, my dad liberated, you know, here are all these American PWs.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they've been treated really well in German camps. Now, you know, clearly they know what's happening, you know, and they've treated our prisoners really well.
Yeah.
Japanese did not. I mean, they're killing them up to the last minute. Right
Yeah.
there. I mean, it was, his father hated the Japanese because he was in the Philippines and saw how they treated civilians, and it was just it was a different kind of army.
Yeah. It was. I mean, even there, I saw one survey, so when they were able to start doing the surveys again, they followed within like 30 days after D-Day, they started to do interviews with men. Even men who had been injured multiple times in that landing did not blame the Germans, did not have a vengeful attitude toward the Germans. I mean, there was one interview I was reading, basically like a lot of these guys are kids, they're like 16 and 17 years old, did not show the kind of vengeful attitude you might imagine so quickly after D-Day. Like this is a month after D-Day, and there's still a lot of the war to take place. I was surprised by that. And of course, I mean, I know about how they treated POWs and mutual respect. But it's still fascinating how I think at the end, and this was really helpful, and one of the reasons they continued to survey was because they were preparing for occupation. And so this was really helpful information to know, like, what was it going to be like to have all these American soldiers in Germany, occupying Germany. And so I think it made them feel a lot better about what that occupation would look like, the soldiers. Yeah, there's lots of hands. Should we go in the back and work our way up?
Spoke about the attitude of the American soldier about the Germans. What about after the soldiers saw the concentration camps?
No, that's
That is a really good question. I don't know if they conducted a survey of the men who liberated and who would have had that firsthand experience encounter, because some of the surveys that I saw were in June and July, but I don't know the answer to that question. I don't.
We did have some soldiers who visited the foundation years ago, and they said they never knew what they were fighting for until after they went into concentration.
Right, right.
They were cynical, just like the reports say.
Yeah, I believe that. That's a really good question. There are other, yeah.
Early on, you alluded to, with sort of the wink wink,
Yeah.
the similarity to what's going on here today. Is there anything in the early part of the studies that would help us in the situation we find ourselves in? The military's having a terrible time recruiting.
Yeah.
There's a whole host of problems that are sort of similar to that.
Yeah. I don't think so. So when I think in that particular question about attitudes, I mean, for me, what I take away from it is that this isn't just a problem for the here and now, that this was a problem back in the 1940s. So particularly about the uses of the media. But I mean, for me, I think some of the cynicism comes out of the experience from World War I and how the media helped to, what they thought, to manipulate the American public. So that might be feeding some of that sentiment. But the studies that I looked at about those attitudes didn't dive deeply into the reasons for the cynicism. It was more of we need to change these attitudes. But I think that what did help was the newsreels and the film, that rather than just relying upon the printed word, but if they just showed them the images from the war, that that would be more believable to them. And I think that's another reason why they use so much film, is probably because of that cynicism of print media and the newspaper. That's my guess on that one. Another really good question. Yeah.
Did the surveys help them determine with the GI Bill to provide education and financing for homes as opposed to just a separation pay?
Oh, definitely. Because like I said, there were the corresponding courses and the education that was being done through that program. I mean, like I said, 1 million men took advantage of that. So they part of the surveys was to ask them, like, what kind of courses did you want to take? And I don't think that was only for what the military was doing, but also for educational institutions back in the States to be prepared for the kind of courses and the number. So the number of people. So what they did was they surveyed men, not only about their general knowledge, but also what they wanted to do with the GI Bill once they had it. Do you want to go back into business? Do you want to go back into farming? And so they relied on that survey in trying to understand the scope of the GI Bill and how it would serve returning veterans. So they spent a lot of time on the GI Bill, because this is their thing, that they learned from the mistakes of World War I of how important that transition and how it would affect public opinion. And mind you, they were preparing to introduce universal military training, and were really mindful of that. So a lot of that emphasis on the GI Bill and what they were doing was to help persuade the public to support universal military training for the post-war world. So it wasn't just about the veterans and their needs, but also about America's place in the world. Yeah.